Workers, do not be deceived by the familiar lies whispered into your ears since childhood. You are told that your struggle is personal, that your failure is individual, that your neighbor is your rival and your fellow worker your enemy. You are taught to compete, to scramble, to trample, so that you never look up and see who truly stands above you. This is no accident. This is design. The system that governs your lives survives not by harmony, but by division. It knows that united hands can shatter chains, while isolated fists only bruise the air. And so it trains you from the factory floor to the classroom, from the office to the street, to see one another not as comrades but as obstacles. Capitalism presents itself as freedom, yet it organizes society as a battlefield, where workers fight workers for crumbs, while the owners feast in safety. You compete for wages, for jobs, for recognition, never for power. The system praises merit while quietly inheriting privilege. It glorifies hard work while extracting surplus value from your labor. It calls inequality natural, though it is carefully manufactured. Ask yourselves who benefits when workers are divided, who profits when fear replaces solidarity, when the unemployed blame the employed, when one nation's workers are set against another. When race, gender and religion are weaponized to fracture the working class. Who wins? Not you, never you. The capitalist does not fear your exhaustion, it is profitable. It does not fear your obedience, it is expected. What it fears, what it must prevent at all costs, is your consciousness. Because the moment you recognize that your suffering is shared, the moment you understand that exploitation is systemic and not personal, competition loses its spell, and in that moment unity becomes possible. Competition is the ideology of scarcity, imposed by those who hoard abundance. It convinces you there is not enough dignity, not enough security, not enough life to go around. But the truth is simple and devastating. The world produces enough for all, yet wealth accumulates in the hands of the few. Poverty is not a failure of production. It is a success of exploitation. Under capitalism, labor is reduced to a commodity, human time to a resource, life itself to an input. You are valued not for your humanity, but for your profitability. And when you are no longer profitable, you are discarded, blamed, and forgotten. This is not an economic system, it is a social relation of domination. Yet history does not move by the will of the powerful alone. Every ruling class imagines its rule eternal, and everyone is proven wrong. The same forces that enrich the bourgeoisie create the conditions of their downfall, by concentrating workers, by disciplining them, by subjecting them to the same conditions of exploitation. Capitalism forges its own gravediggers. The working class is not weak because it lacks numbers. It is weak only when it lacks unity. When workers see themselves as isolated individuals, they are powerless. When they recognize themselves as a class, they become unstoppable. Do not ask how to win within the system. Ask why the system must be won at all. Do not compete for survival in a game rigged against you. Organize to change the rules or abolish the game entirely. Unity is not charity, it is strategy. Solidarity is not moral sentiment, it is material necessity. Through organization, through collective struggle, through conscious action, workers transform from objects of history into its authors. The system teaches you to compete, so you never unite. Your task is to unlearn this lesson. Look to one another, recognize your shared condition, understand your common enemy, and then act not as rivals but as comrades. For when the workers of the world unite, competition collapses, exploitation trembles, and history takes a decisive step forward. Competition is deliberately cultivated to prevent working-class unity, not as a natural outcome of human ambition, but as a calculated social mechanism embedded deep within the structure of capitalist society. From the earliest stages of life, individuals are conditioned to measure themselves against one another, to rank, outperform, and outpace their peers, long before they ever encounter the factory, the office, or the marketplace. This conditioning is ideological, not accidental. It teaches workers to internalize the logic of capital, to see scarcity as inevitable, and to believe that survival itself depends on defeating those who share their material condition. Under capitalism, competition is presented as freedom of choice, yet it functions as a tool of discipline. Workers are compelled to compete for wages, positions, and stability in a system where access to these necessities is intentionally limited. This scarcity is not the result of insufficient production, but of private ownership of the means of production, which concentrates wealth and decision-making power in the hands of a few. By forcing workers into competition, the system ensures that their energy is directed horizontally against one another rather than vertically toward those who profit from their labor. This competition fragments the working class into isolated individuals, each struggling alone, each made to believe that their success or failure is purely personal. When one worker is promoted, another is excluded. When one secures employment, another is left unemployed. These outcomes are framed as meritocratic results, disguising the structural reality that exploitation persists, regardless of individual advancement. The system requires losers as much as it celebrates winners, yet it blames the former for their condition while using the latter as proof of fairness. The ideological power of competition lies in its ability to obscure class relations. When workers see one another as rivals, they cease to recognize themselves as members of the same class. Their shared exploitation becomes invisible. Beneath surface differences of income, status, identity, or nationality, capitalism exploits these differences, amplifying them to fracture solidarity. Race, gender, religion, and citizenship are weaponized to intensify competition, ensuring that resentment flows downward and sideways rather than upward. Competition also produces fear, and fear is a powerful inhibitor of resistance. The fear of unemployment, of replacement, of falling behind compels workers to accept deteriorating conditions, longer hours, lower wages, and greater precarity. When every worker is made to feel disposable, collective action appears risky, even irrational. The threat of being outcompeted suppresses dissent more effectively than overt repression, because it operates within the worker's own consciousness. This internalization of competition transforms workers into self-regulating agents of their own domination. They monitor their productivity, compare themselves incessantly to others, and discipline their own behavior to meet the demands of capital. The employer no longer needs constant coercion. The competitive environment enforces compliance. Workers begin to identify with the logic of the market, defending a system that exploits them because they have been taught to see themselves as potential winners rather than collective producers. By preventing unity, competition neutralizes the most dangerous force in capitalist society, organized labor conscious of its historical role. Unity threatens the foundation of capitalist power because it challenges private control over social wealth. A united working class does not beg for inclusion, it demands transformation. It does not seek advantage of other workers, it seeks control over the conditions of production itself. Competition must therefore be intensified whenever solidarity begins to emerge. Even crises, which expose the irrationality and brutality of capitalism, are used to deepen competition. During economic collapse, workers pitted against one another for fewer jobs, fewer resources, fewer protections. Austerity is justified as necessity, while profits are preserved. The system ensures that anger is redirected toward fellow workers, migrants, or the unemployed, rather than toward the structure that produces crisis after crisis. Competition is thus not merely an economic principle, but a political strategy. It maintains order without stability, obedience without consent, and inequality without revolt. It dissolves collective identity and replaces it with isolated struggle, ensuring that exploitation continues uninterrupted. As long as workers remain divided, capital remains secure, accumulation continues, and domination reproduces itself daily through ordinary social relations. Capitalism thrives on division while extracting surplus value from labor, and this relationship is not incidental but foundational to its survival. The capitalist mode of production depends upon separating human beings from one another, while simultaneously binding them to a system that feeds on their collective work. Division is not merely a social consequence of capitalism, it is an active process through which exploitation is maintained, justified, and intensified. By fragmenting the working class, capitalism obscures the true source of wealth and conceals the mechanisms through which labor is systematically robbed. At the heart of capitalism lies surplus value, the unpaid labor extracted from workers and appropriated by those who own the means of production. Workers sell their labor power for a wage that represents only a portion of the value they create. The difference between what labor produces and what labor is paid becomes profit, accumulated privately by capitalists who contribute no labor of their own. This process is normalized, rendered invisible through contracts, markets, and the illusion of equal exchange, yet it remains a form of legalized exploitation sustained by social power. Division is essential to preserving this arrangement because surplus value can only be extracted reliably when workers are prevented from acting collectively. If labor were united, conscious of its shared exploitation, it could disrupt production, challenge ownership, and demand control over the wealth it creates. Capitalism, therefore, cultivates divisions across every possible line occupation, income level, nationality, race, gender, and legal status, ensuring that workers experience their exploitation as individual hardship rather than collective dispossession. These divisions are reinforced through ideology. Workers are taught to identify not as a class, but as competitors, consumers, or aspiring capitalists. The myth of upward mobility convinces individuals that their interests align with those above them rather than with those beside them. Even minimal differences in wages or status are exaggerated to foster resentment and hierarchy within the working class itself. A worker who earns slightly more is encouraged to see themselves as superior, while those earning less are blamed for their condition, fracturing any sense of shared struggle. The extraction of surplus value also relies on the alienation of labor. Workers are separated from the products they create, from the process of production, from their fellow workers, and ultimately from their own human potential. Labor becomes a means of survival rather than an expression of life. This alienation weakens solidarity by reducing work to a private burden endured in isolation. When workers do not recognize their labor as part of a collective social process, they are less likely to recognize exploitation as a shared condition. Capitalism further deepens division by globalizing production while nationalizing blame. Capital moves freely across borders in search of cheaper labor and higher profits, while workers are confined by borders, laws, and identities. When capital relocates or wages decline, workers are encouraged to blame foreign labor rather than the system that exploits labor everywhere. This international division of the working class allows surplus value to be extracted on a global scale, while resistance remains fragmented and localized. Even technological advancement, which could reduce human labor and expand freedom, is weaponized to increase exploitation. Automation is introduced not to liberate workers, but to discipline them. The threat of replacement forces workers to accept lower wages and worse conditions, while productivity gains increase surplus value captured by capital. Those displaced by technology are set against those still employed, deepening insecurity and competition rather than fostering collective demands for shared benefits. The state plays a crucial role in maintaining these divisions. Through law, policing, and economic policy, it protects private property and enforces the conditions necessary for surplus value extraction. Labor laws are weakened, unions are restricted, and social safety nets are dismantled, all in the name of efficiency and growth. These measures isolate workers further, making resistance appear dangerous and futile, while normalizing exploitation as economic necessity. Capitalism thrives because it transforms social cooperation into private profit, while denying workers control over either. It extracts value from labor collectively but rewards it individually, ensuring that workers remain divided even as they produce together. This contradiction is masked by the constant reinforcement of division, which keeps workers focused on survival within the system rather than transformation of it. As long as division prevails, surplus value continues to flow upward, accumulating power for a few, while the many remain bound to a system that consumes their labor and fragments their strength. Inequality is systemic, not the result of individual failure, and this truth stands in direct opposition to the dominant narrative promoted by capitalist society. From the moment inequality appears, the system rushes to personalize it, to assign blame to individuals rather than to structures, to moralize outcomes that are produced by economic relations beyond personal control. Poverty is framed as laziness, wealth as virtue, success as effort, and failure as weakness. This ideological maneuver is essential because if inequality were understood as systemic, the legitimacy of the system itself would immediately come into question. Capitalism organizes society around private ownership of the means of production, a structure that ensures wealth flows upward regardless of individual talent, intelligence, or effort. Those who own land, factories, machines, and capital command the labor of those who own nothing but their capacity to work. This relationship predetermines inequality before any individual action takes place. A worker may labor harder, longer, and more skillfully than a capitalist, yet the value produced by that labor is appropriated by the owner through wages that never reflect the full value created. No amount of personal discipline can overcome a structure designed to extract surplus from one class to enrich another. The system depends on unequal starting positions and reproduces them continuously. Access to education, healthcare, housing, nutrition, and safety is distributed according to class position, not merit. A child born into wealth inherits security, networks, and opportunity long before making a single choice. A child born into poverty inherits instability, scarcity, and surveillance. These conditions shape outcomes across an entire lifetime, yet capitalism presents them as neutral or natural, as if society were a level playing field, distorted only by individual behavior. Labor markets further entrench inequality by commodifying human survival. Workers must sell their labor to live, while capitalists can withhold investment without consequence. Wages are not determined by need or contribution, but by power, relations, and labor supply. Unemployment is not an accident, but a structural necessity, maintaining a reserve army of labor that disciplines those who are employed. This permanent threat ensures that workers accept inequality as unavoidable, internalizing insecurity as a personal failure rather than recognizing it as a systemic feature. Even when individuals momentarily escape poverty, the system uses these exceptions to reinforce the myth of meritocracy. Isolated success stories are elevated as proof that anyone can succeed, while the millions who cannot are rendered invisible or blamed. These narratives function as ideological cover, diverting attention away from the structural mechanisms that ensure inequality persists regardless of effort. The rare individual who ascends does not negate the rule. They confirm it by making exploitation appear fair. Inequality is also reproduced through law and state power. Legal systems protect private property above all else, criminalizing survival. Strategies of the poor while shielding corporate exploitation. Tax structures favor capital over labor, inheritance over work, accumulation over redistribution. Social programs are framed as burdens rather than rights, stigmatizing those who rely on them while subsidizing those who already possess wealth. The state does not correct inequality, it manages it in a way that preserves existing power relations. Cultural ideology plays a decisive role in sustaining this system. Media, education, and popular discourse constantly emphasize personal responsibility while erasing structural analysis. Workers are taught to compete rather than cooperate, to self-optimize rather than organize, to blame themselves rather than the system. This psychological internalization of inequality is one of capitalism's most effective tools, because it transforms social domination into self-discipline and self-reproach. Global inequality further exposes the systemic nature of exploitation. Entire regions are locked into poverty not because of individual shortcomings, but because of historical extraction, colonial plunder, and unequal exchange. Wealth flows from the global periphery to the center through supply chain, built on cheap labor, resource depletion, and political coercion. Workers in different nations experience different conditions, yet they are bound by the same system that enriches a minority through their collective labor. When inequality is understood as systemic, it becomes clear that no amount of individual success can resolve it. Charity cannot replace justice, motivation cannot overcome exploitation, and personal resilience cannot dismantle structures designed to concentrate power. Inequality persists because it is produced daily through ordinary economic relations, reinforced by ideology, protected by law, and normalized by culture, shaping life chances long before individuals are able to act within the confines imposed upon them. Class consciousness transforms workers from isolated individuals into a collective force by revealing the hidden social relations that bind their lives together beneath the surface of everyday experience. Under capitalism, workers are encouraged to see themselves as separate units, each responsible for their own survival, advancement, and failure. This isolation is not natural, it is produced. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize that their struggles are not individual misfortune, but expressions of a shared condition rooted in the organization of society itself. Without class consciousness, workers experience exploitation as personal stress, insecurity, or dissatisfaction rather than as a structural relationship. Long hours feel like private sacrifice, low wages like personal inadequacy, unemployment like individual defeat. Capitalism depends on this fragmented perception because it prevents workers from identifying the true source of their hardship. Class consciousness dissolves this illusion by connecting personal experience to collective reality, allowing workers to understand that what they endure is endured by millions under the same economic system. This transformation begins with the recognition of class position. Workers come to see that they share a common relationship to the means of production. They do not own them, yet they operate them. Their labor generates wealth they do not control, and their survival depends on selling their labor power to those who do. This shared position unites workers across professions, cultures, and identities, forming the material basis for solidarity. Differences remain, but they no longer obscure the fundamental division between those who labor and those who profit. Class consciousness also exposes the antagonistic nature of capitalist society. It clarifies that the interests of workers and capitalists are not aligned but opposed. Higher profits require lower labor costs. Job security for workers conflicts with flexibility for capital, Dignity at work clashes with relentless accumulation. Once these contradictions are understood, cooperation with exploitation gives way to resistance against it. Workers cease to see concessions as generosity and begin to see them as gains wrested through struggle. Through class consciousness, workers rediscover their collective power. Individually, a worker is replaceable. Collectively, workers are indispensable. Production depends on their cooperation, and when that cooperation is withdrawn or redirected, the system falters. Strikes, unions, and mass movements arise not from abstract ideals, but from this material realization of shared strength. Consciousness turns passive endurance into active organization, transforming dispersed labor into a unified social force. This collective force reshapes how workers relate to one another. Competition gives way to solidarity, suspicion to trust, resignation to purpose. Workers begin to defend one another not out of charity, but out of recognition that an injury to one weakens all. Mutual support becomes a practical necessity rather than a moral gesture. Through shared struggle, workers develop new forms of social relations that contradict the atomization imposed by capitalism. Class consciousness also challenges the ideological narratives that sustain domination. Meritocracy, individualism, and neutrality of the market are revealed as myths that conceal power relations. Workers learn that the system does not reward effort fairly, does not operate impartially, and does not serve the common good. This demystification weakens the authority of ruling ideas and opens space for alternative visions of social organization grounded in collective control and shared benefit. As consciousness deepens, it extends beyond immediate economic demands toward broader social transformation. Workers begin to question not only wages and hours, but ownership, governance, and the purpose of production itself. They ask why wealth created collectively is owned privately, why democratic principles stop at the workplace door, why human needs are subordinated to profit. These questions mark the transition from reformist demands to revolutionary awareness. Class consciousness is not spontaneous or automatic. It develops through struggle, education, and organization. It grows in moments of crisis, in collective action, in the confrontation between lived reality and ideological promises. Each strike, each protest, each act of resistance contributes to this awakening, strengthening the understanding. That liberation cannot be achieved individually within the system, but only collectively against it. When workers grasp themselves as a class, history changes direction. The working class ceases to be a passive object shaped by economic forces and becomes an active subject capable of reshaping society. Consciousness turns labor from a fragmented mass into a coordinated power, capable of challenging domination, reorganizing production, and asserting control over the conditions of life, transforming exploitation into struggle, and struggle into a material force that moves against the existing order. Organized solidarity is the greatest threat to capitalist power because it directly confronts the foundation upon which that power rests, the isolation and fragmentation of the working class. Capitalism can tolerate anger, suffering, and even rebellion as long as these remain uncoordinated and individualized. What it cannot tolerate is a unified, conscious, and organized mass of workers acting in their shared interests. Solidarity transforms scattered discontent into structured resistance. An organization turns resistance into a material force capable of disrupting accumulation and challenging authority. Capitalist power is not maintained solely through wealth or coercion, but through the management of social relations. Workers are separated from one another by competition, hierarchy, and ideology, ensuring that their grievances never converge into a collective challenge. Organized solidarity dismantles this separation. It reveals that workers' struggles are interconnected and that their Strength lies not in individual endurance but in collective action. Once workers begin to act together, the asymmetry of power between labor and capital begins to shift. The workplace is a central site of this conflict. Individually, workers are vulnerable, replaceable, and dependent. Collectively, they are indispensable. Production does not occur through capital alone. It requires coordinated human labor. When workers organize, they gain the ability to withhold that labor, disrupt it. The flow of surplus value upon which capitalist profit depends. This is why strikes, unions, and collective bargaining have historically provoked such fierce opposition from capital. They expose the reality that power does not originate solely from ownership, but from cooperation. Organized solidarity also undermines the ideological narratives that legitimize capitalism. The myth of meritocracy collapses when workers recognize that their condition improve not through individual effort alone, but through collective struggle. Rights that are presented as gifts from above are revealed as concessions extracted from below. This realization weakens the moral authority of capitalist institutions and challenges the idea that existing hierarchies are natural or just. Capitalist power relies heavily on predictability and control. Markets must function smoothly, labor must remain disciplined, and social unrest must be manageable. Organized solidarity introduces uncertainty into this system. Coordinated action disrupts schedules, halts production, and forces negotiations on terms not dictated by capital alone. Even the potential for organization exerts pressure, compelling capital to make concessions to prevent broader unrest. The mere possibility of collective resistance alters the balance of power. Solidarity also extends beyond the workplace into broader social life. When workers organize, they begin to challenge not only economic exploitation, but also political exclusion and social inequality. Movements for labor rights often intersect with struggles against racism, patriarchy, and imperialism, recognizing that these forms of domination reinforce one another. This expansion of solidarity threatens capitalist power because it unites diverse struggles into a common front against systemic oppression. The state plays a crucial role in responding to organized solidarity. Laws restricting unions, criminalizing strikes, and limiting protest are not neutral regulations, but defensive measures designed to protect capital. Repression intensifies precisely when solidarity becomes effective, revealing where real power lies. Yet repression alone cannot eliminate organized resistance, because it addresses symptoms rather than causes. As long as exploitation persists, the basis for solidarity remains. Capital attempts to neutralize this threat by co-opting organization, channeling it into controlled and fragmented forms. Bureaucratic unions, symbolic participation, and limited reforms are encouraged when they preserve the overall structure of domination. Genuine solidarity, however, cannot be contained within narrow limits. It pushes beyond immediate demands toward questions of ownership, control, and purpose. It challenges why a minority commands the labor of the majority and why social wealth is distributed according to power rather than need. Organized solidarity reshapes workers' understanding of themselves and their capacity to act. Fear gives way to confidence, resignation to determination. Through shared struggle, workers develop political awareness, strategic discipline, and collective identity. They learn that their power does not lie in appealing to the morality of capital, but in their ability to disrupt its functioning. This awareness is deeply threatening because it cannot be easily reversed once gained. History repeatedly demonstrates that major social transformations occur not when individuals rise alone, but when masses organize together. Capitalist power despite its resources and institutions, remains dependent on labor. It does not control absolute. Organized solidarity exposes this dependence and turns it into leverage. By uniting workers across sectors, regions, and identities, solidarity transforms exploitation into a point of resistance, coordination into a weapon against domination, making visible the latent power that exists wherever labor acts in common. The truth that emerges from all this is unmistakable. The system survives only so long as workers remain divided, confused, and isolated from one another. Competition, inequality, alienation, and fragmentation are not failures of capitalism but its operating principles, carefully maintained to protect the power of those who own while millions labor. Yet within this same system lies its contradiction. Capital depends on collective labor while denying collective power. The moment workers recognize themselves as a class, the illusion of inevitability begins to collapse. Consciousness replaces resignation, solidarity replaces competition, and organization replaces helplessness. History is not driven by markets or machines, but by human struggle, and every gain wrested from exploitation has been won through collective action. The future will not be handed down by those in power. It must be taken by those who produce all wealth yet possess none of it. When workers unite across divisions, reject the myths that bind them, and organize with purpose and clarity, capitalist power reveals itself as fragile and contingent. The task ahead is not to reform exploitation, but to abolish it, not to compete within oppression, but to dismantle its foundation, and not to wait for liberation, but to build it through conscious, organized, and relentless collective struggle.